right, since we're talking about Mexico, here's another crazy email from the Mexican email file. Yeah, I gather up the emails and file them under various Latin American countries they pertain to, all 20 of them. How about this one coming from Mr. M? He says, Johnny, earlier this summer, I came across a flyer posted in Colonia Roma in Mexico City that read like this, in both English and Spanish, quote, "Are you new here in Mexico City? Are you working remotely? Then you're a plague, and the locals hate you. Leave now." Wow, that's really welcoming, huh? Anyway, it goes on to say, that kind of language took me aback, but it wasn't anything new. I've been receiving comments just like those on social media for over the last year. Even posting simple videos of me having lunch with my Mexican girlfriend sparks accusations of being called a colonizer, a parasite, and worse. My story goes like this, and I'll paraphrase. This is a long one. In the summer of 2020, I fell in love with a Mexican girl from Mexico City via one of those dating apps, and I moved down there to pursue the relationship. We spent the first year mostly in lockdown in the self-contained, very nice, tranquil neighborhood of Condesa. It felt like a relative bubble of safety in an unpredictable pandemic world. For me, Mexico City seemed like the perfect place to reduce my expenses and focus on immersing myself in a new culture. Then, sadly, after a year and a half together, we broke up. I won't go into the details, but suffice it to say, on top of the heartbreak, I suffered a jolt as my life in Mexico was suddenly turned upside down. I lost my connection and my anchor to the place, he says. My direct connection was severed. He says the relationship that brought me here no longer existed, and after a year and a half of socializing mostly with Mexicans, I no longer had a community. I felt unwelcome and seriously thought of going home, but I decided to stay. There were practical reasons. I had already registered as a temporary resident, rented a furnished apartment, and created a sort of nice, de-stressed lifestyle. But something happened within my next year and a half here. The city has changed dramatically since I first arrived here in September 2020. Back then, 2 years ago, I felt like I was one of the only foreigners around. Every other building on Avenida Amsterdam had a se renta or se vende sign, meaning things were for rent or for sale. Landlords were desperate to fill vacant buildings, and it was a buyer's and a renter's market. And now, just 2 years later, the same neighborhoods are absolutely filled with gringos. Housing is scarce and rents are rising. English is now spoken so widely it's possible to bounce around between gringo-friendly establishments without ever having to speak words of Spanish. All right, me Johnny here. Sounds like just the opposite of what's happening in Miami, huh? Where you don't need English anymore. Then he says, while I've always been an enthusiastic promoter of Mexico, I now see the wave of visitors is bigger than most people ever realized. It's having real-life negative consequences that are altering the hopes and dreams of average Mexicans. So what happened in those 2 short years, the COVID lockdown years? Well, previous to that, a guy named Tim Ferriss, who has a podcast, started out the digital nomad revolution with a book, The 4-Hour Work Week. He talked about working at home or in a third world country, earning income in a strong currency like the dollar, while living in a country with a much cheaper currency like Mexico. And at first, before COVID came, only the brave and resourceful attempted this so-called digital nomad lifestyle. They congregated where Wi-Fi was strong and a lifestyle laid back and much cheaper than back in the States. At first, only brave, young, and single people tried this digital nomad lifestyle, and it was mostly in Southeastern Asia, like Thailand or Indonesia. Then came COVID. The pandemic changed everything. Corporate America went remote overnight. Suddenly, millions of people with salaries pegged to the cost of living in San Francisco or New York were free to work anywhere. Coincidentally, Mexico was one of the only places U.S. citizens could travel during lockdowns. They had very loose and liberal vaccine and testing norms, too. So initially, 2+ years ago, when the lockdown started, most escaped to the beaches of Tulum, Cancun, Playa del Carmen, Sayulita, and Puerto Escondido. But the Wi-Fi is not quite stable enough to work from some of those beachside towns, especially the smaller one-horse towns. For good, solid, stable internet, you had to go to Mexico City. And many did and were pleasantly surprised. And Mexico City, Distrito Federal, as it's called, has many advantages. It sits squarely within the U.S. time zones, making it easy to continue working for U.S. companies. And when the companies do require workers to return to the physical office or plant, it's only 2 hours to the southern U.S. or 4 hours to L.A., New York, or Chicago. Though technically this is very good for the growth of Mexico and the tech sector, etc. That sudden influx of well-paid remote workers dramatically altered the landscape of the city, effectively crowding out middle-class locals, thoroughly pissing them off in the process, just like tech companies did in San Francisco. The main factor is now we have a housing bubble. Most foreigners stay in just a few adjacent neighborhoods in Mexico City, Condesa, Roma, Juarez, and others. In short, these neighborhoods that are trendy for wealthy Mexicans too. This also attracts tourists for the safety and nightlife. The problem is social media is pumping the shit out of just a few neighborhoods, romanticizing their appeal of living in Mexico City to the exclusion of much less sexy neighborhoods nearby. To be clear, he says, this process was already happening before the pandemic struck, but during that initial moment of shock, many locals living there returned home and failed to make rent. So when locals left or sold out, the housing market took off and went into a big bubble. Worse yet, a positive feedback loop occurred. Many landlords had empty buildings they decided to turn into Airbnbs to cash in on the gringo digital nomad boom. This in turn reduced the stock of available housing, pushing prices even higher, making these once attainable neighborhoods completely out of reach for countless middle and working class Mexicans. Then he says all of this plays out against the backdrop of Mexico's vast inequality, exasperation with the impunity of abuse from elites, and centuries-old divisions along ethnic and class and social lines. In a place where wealth buys power and the lighter skin affords preferential treatment, the sudden arrival of thousands and thousands of wealthy, foreign, predominantly gringo white people pours fuel on that fire. Then he ends by saying thousands of Americans set off on their Mexico City adventure each day, but few realize what a shitstorm they're walking into. All right, me Johnny here. Yeah, shitstorms. I've heard of those. If that doesn't swear you off having a plan B in Mexico City, don't forget to bring a couple cases of toilet paper with you if you do. Shitstorms aren't good when your plumbing can't handle the TP. By the way, that wealthy area in Mexico City where the gringos and expats like to hang, Roma Condesa Corridor, it's called. The rent for a flat, 1 or 2 bedroom, ranges between $700 and $3,000 a month. Cheaper than New York, San Francisco, and Chicago by about half. Now, you might be wondering, when they talk about how middle class and working class Mexicans can't afford to live there, I think you'll understand that situation much better based on the fact that just this week, the Volkswagen plant in the state of Puebla, Mexico, went on strike for higher wages. There's 7,000 people working at that plant, almost all of them unionized, and they're asking for a 9% across-the-board wage increase. The union salaries at the Puebla plant range from $15 to $48, not an hour, a day. That means workers there make from $300 a month to $960 a month. So, figure it out. Not one of the 7,000 union workers at that plant could ever afford to live in the Roma Condesa, Mexico City district. Not even in the cheapest one-bedroom apartment where rent starts at $700 a month. Meanwhile, last week, you may have heard of this, drug cartel members attacked a series of convenience stores in the north. They torched taxis and buses, along with 20 branches of Latin America's largest convenience store chain, called OXXO. Wait, there's more. Then we've got that battle you might have heard about in Tijuana on Saturday, August 12, 2022. Began at a prison. A fight between 2 rival cartels that left 11 people dead. Then the chaos spread outside into the streets of the city, where vehicles and houses were torched and the cartels set up roadblocks on public streets. I know what you're thinking. Tijuana is a shithole. It always has been, but it's a tourist haven for Americans who want to pop over the border, and they still can't keep it safe. Organized crime specialists are saying that the cartels, not the government, are in charge. Here's another little thing about Mexico that's both sad and amusing. Did you know that every drug cartel has clandestine workshops set up to create what are called narco tanks, armored up to plow through streets with impunity? What they do is buy new SUVs and trucks like the Ford F-350 and the Dodge Ram, Tahoe, etc. They add internal panels with a special kind of very light, bulletproof steel made by Swedish manufacturers. Now, here's the real scary and unbelievable part. Since 2018, 630 of these armored narco tanks have been confiscated by Mexico's National Ministry of Defense. You can see on the internet photos released by authorities showing heavily modified pickup trucks and SUVs fitted with armored plating, bulletproof glass, machine gun turrets, among other military-style features. These trucks are seen often by the local public, rolling down the streets, commonly referred to as narco tanks or Tanques monstruos, monster tanks. They even have cartel and gang logos etched into them, so everyone knows exactly which cartel owns those streets. Isn't that nice? Munitions experts who've tested them out say they can absorb repeated volleys of 50 caliber machine gun blasts. All right, I get it. There are some very nice places in Mexico, little islands of gringo prosperity. But here's the question, and it's a very serious question. Is the news out of Mexico, at least in the last 11 or 12 years I've been doing this show, getting better or worse? Need I answer that? Is there any doubt whatsoever? So what does that portend for the future? I wonder. I say go ahead, move there. It's always your decision. The thing is, only someone who's got something wrong with his synapses would move to a place where the news is continually getting worse and worse. However, if the news out of Mexico was getting better, or even staying neutral, that would be a different story. But it ain't. I know, I'm going to get emails. But Johnny, I love Mexico.